Jacqueline Dioro. In April 2025, authorities in New Jersey arrested Jacqueline Dioro on charges that seemed pulled from a crime thriller. The 31-year-old from Brick Township allegedly attempted to hire someone to carry out a plan targeting multiple people, including a police officer, her former partner, and his new girlfriend. The case exposed how desperation and rage can drive someone to cross lines most people couldn't imagine. Dioro allegedly used Tinder, the dating app, not to find romance but to locate someone willing to accept payment for harming others. She reportedly connected with an undercover law enforcement officer posing as a potential contractor. During their communications, Dioro allegedly discussed specifics about who she wanted targeted and how much she was willing to pay. The investigation revealed her motivations stemmed from custody disputes and personal grievances. She allegedly wanted her ex harmed to gain custody advantages, while the police officer had become involved in matters related to her case. The targeting of her ex's new girlfriend suggested jealousy played a role alongside custody concerns. How did authorities uncover the plot? Law enforcement became aware of Dioro's search for someone to carry out her plans through online monitoring. An undercover officer initiated contact and engaged in recorded conversations where Dioro allegedly laid out her intentions, discussed payment arrangements, and provided identifying information about her intended targets. These recordings became central evidence in building the case against her. The undercover operation continued over multiple interactions, with Dioro allegedly becoming more specific about her requirements. She discussed timelines, locations, and methods, demonstrating what prosecutors would characterize as serious intent rather than idle fantasies. The detail level suggested she had thought through the logistics. Dioro was arrested and charged with attempted murder for hire and related offenses. The charges carry significant potential sentences if she's convicted, though, as of the available information, her case remains in the pre-trial phase. She entered not guilty pleas, and her defense team prepared arguments for proceedings. What defense strategy emerged? Her attorneys will likely argue about intent versus fantasy, questioning whether recorded conversations represented genuine planning or expressions of frustration she never intended to execute. The distinction between talking about hiring someone and actually taking concrete steps toward that goal becomes crucial in attempted murder-for-hire cases. The case raised questions about how seriously to take online expressions of intent. In an era where people sometimes express extreme thoughts digitally without meaning to act on them, prosecutors must demonstrate that Dioro's actions crossed from protected speech into criminal territory. The undercover officer's testimony about her level of commitment will be critical. For the intended targets, learning about the alleged plot created lasting fear. The police officer who was allegedly targeted had been performing his duties and became a target simply for involvement in matters related to Dioro's legal issues. Her ex and his girlfriend faced the knowledge that someone they once knew had allegedly sought to have them harmed. As of 2025, Dioro's case proceeds through New Jersey's court system. Pre-trial motions address evidence admissibility, particularly regarding the undercover operations recordings. The outcome will depend on whether prosecutors can prove she took substantial steps toward hiring someone, rather than merely expressing wishes she never intended to fulfill. Dioro remains held pending trial, with bail set at a level reflecting the serious nature of the charges. Her trial date will determine whether she joins the ranks of New Jersey women convicted of attempting or committing serious offenses, or whether her defense successfully argues the charges don't match her actual intent. The next case takes us to Atlantic City's tourism district. Antoinette Pelzer. On May 21, 2012, Atlantic City's Pacific Avenue witnessed a shocking daytime attack that would horrify two nations. Antoinette Pelzer, 46, approached two Canadian tourists walking in the tourism district. Pauline Wan, 80, and her daughter Alice May C. Leong, 47, from Scarborough, Ontario, were enjoying their visit when Pelzer confronted them. Armed with a 13-inch butcher knife, Pelzer attempted to rob the tourists. When they resisted or couldn't comply quickly enough, she attacked. Leong was stabbed in the upper body, while Juan received multiple wounds to her lower body, hand, and shoulder as she tried to shield her daughter from the blade. The assault happened in broad daylight, with numerous witnesses present. Surveillance cameras captured the attack, providing clear video evidence of what transpired. The footage showed Pelzer approaching the tourists, the confrontation escalating, and the stabbing occurring on a public street where visitors should have felt safe. Several bystanders witnessed the horror but were unable to intervene before serious harm occurred. Fortune provided one advantage to investigators. An Atlantic City police officer on routine patrol saw the incident unfold. The officer immediately ordered Pelzer to drop the weapon and arrested her at the scene. Emergency responders rushed both victims to AtlantiCare Regional Medical Center, but despite medical efforts, both women succumbed to their injuries. What drove Pelzer to such an act? Pelzer was homeless and living in Philadelphia at the time, struggling with poverty and mental health challenges. She had a documented history of psychological issues, though the extent of her treatment prior to the incident remains unclear. Prosecutors argued that while mental illness affected her, it didn't excuse the deliberate choice to arm herself and target vulnerable tourists. The robbery motive seemed clear. Pelzer needed money and saw tourists as potential targets. However, the extreme response to resistance suggested deeper issues. Most robberies don't escalate to fatal stabbings, particularly of elderly victims and their adult daughters. The level of force used exceeded what would be necessary to simply take property. Pelzer was charged with 2 counts of first-degree homicide, aggravated assault, and weapons offenses. Rather than face trial, she entered guilty pleas on August 30th, 2013. The decision to plead guilty avoided subjecting the victim's family to a lengthy trial and likely influenced her sentencing considerations. On October 24th, 2013, in Atlantic County Superior Court, Judge Bernard Delury sentenced Pelzer to 80 years in prison, 40 years for each count, served consecutively. At 46 during sentencing, the term effectively guaranteed she would die in prison. The consecutive nature of the sentences emphasized that 2 separate lives were taken. During the sentencing hearing, Pelzer apologized to the victim's family, stating she was suffering from mental illness at the time. Her apology acknowledged responsibility while attempting to provide context for her actions. However, the court determined that mental health challenges didn't justify the brutal attack on defenseless tourists. The victim's family released a statement expressing relief that the legal process had concluded, requesting privacy to grieve and hoping Juan and Leong could rest in eternal peace. Their words reflected exhaustion from proceedings and desire to remember their loved ones rather than focus on the person who took them. Prosecutors described it as a heinous act that shattered Atlantic City's reputation as a safe tourist destination. The random nature of the attack, tourists selected simply for appearing vulnerable, created fear among visitors who wondered if they too could become targets. Pelzer serves her sentence at Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women in Clinton, New Jersey. While that case involved robbery gone fatal, the next would expose calculated insurance fraud. Celestine Payne.
Celestine was a devious woman. She would look at you and say, "Child, I didn't do this murder," and almost melt into you. You know, I had nothing to do with this. I would never hurt anybody. And she's using her kids to kill people, including her own father. She's killing her friends. She's killing family people. She's evil.
Between 1991 and 1995 in Paterson, New Jersey, Celestine Payne orchestrated a series of deaths driven purely by financial greed. Her calculated approach to collecting life insurance payouts revealed a mind focused on profit rather than the value of human life. The scheme would ultimately claim 2 lives and seriously harm another before authorities connected the pattern. In 1991, Payne poisoned her husband to collect a $39,000 insurance payout. The method, poison, allowed her to make his death appear natural or accidental. She didn't act alone. Payne enlisted her children, then between 14 and 20 years old, along with Eugene Cooper, an autistic tenant living in her property. Together, they disposed of the body in a box left on a roadside, hoping it would be discovered, but not traced back to them. The insurance payment arrived, validating Payne's method and emboldening her for future schemes. 2 years later, she set her sights on Cooper himself. In 1993, Payne fraudulently obtained a life insurance policy on Cooper, naming herself as beneficiary. She then paid her daughter's boyfriend $60,000, funded by her previous insurance collection, to stab Cooper. Payne falsely claimed Cooper had acted inappropriately to justify her actions, though no evidence supported these allegations. Cooper survived the stabbing but remained in critical condition. In a chilling display of callousness, Payne impersonated Cooper's mother at the hospital to sign a do not resuscitate order, attempting to ensure he wouldn't recover and interfere with her insurance claim. When that plot didn't result in death, Payne moved on to another target. In 1995, she had her daughter pose as 18-year-old Tara Carter to secure another life insurance policy. Once the policy was active with Payne as beneficiary, she orchestrated Carter's ending. The body was dumped in East Side Park where joggers discovered it, triggering a homicide investigation. What finally exposed the pattern? The body discoveries and insurance investigations began revealing connections. Payne's name appeared as beneficiary on multiple policies for people who died under suspicious circumstances. When investigators started examining the insurance applications and beneficiary arrangements, the fraudulent pattern became clear. The fact that unrelated individuals all had policies naming Payne raised immediate red flags. Financial records showed the flow of money from insurance payouts to payments made to those who carried out the physical acts. The paper trail connected Payne to each incident, demonstrating her role as the orchestrator even when others wielded weapons. Her children's involvement added another tragic layer. She had corrupted her own family to assist in her schemes. Arrested in 1997, Payne faced multiple charges related to 2 counts of first-degree homicide and associated offenses. Rather than risk trial, she pleaded guilty, acknowledging her role in the deaths and attacks. The guilty plea allowed prosecutors to secure convictions without the expense and uncertainty of trial. Payne was sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms, meaning the sentences would run simultaneously rather than back-to-back. She became eligible for parole in March 2025 after serving decades behind bars. However, when she sought compassionate release in January 2025, the request was denied. Now in her 70s, Payne remains incarcerated in New Jersey's correctional system. Another case would involve family conflict over property. Kathleen Dorsett. In Camden County, New Jersey, Kathleen Dorsett's relationship with her ex-husband Stephen Moore had deteriorated significantly by 2010. Their divorce had been contentious, leaving lingering resentments that Dorsett couldn't release. Financial disputes and custody issues created ongoing conflict between them, with each interaction reinforcing her anger. On July 6, 2010, Dorsett shot Moore multiple times in what prosecutors characterized as a premeditated attack. She traveled to his location armed with a firearm, suggesting planning rather than spontaneous rage. The number of shots fired indicated determination to ensure he didn't survive. Moore died from the gunshot wounds, leaving behind family members who had to process his death at the hands of someone he'd once been married to. The investigation quickly focused on Dorsett given her known conflicts with Moore and her presence in the area at the time of the shooting. Evidence collected included forensic ballistics linking her weapon to the shots that caused Moore's death. Witness testimony placed her at the scene during the relevant time frame. Cell phone records and other digital evidence corroborated the prosecution's timeline of events. Financial records showed the ongoing disputes that provided motive. What drove her to such an extreme? Divorce proceedings and their aftermath had created substantial financial strain for Dorset. She blamed Moore for her economic difficulties and believed he wasn't meeting obligations from their divorce settlement. The resentment festered until she decided that eliminating Moore was preferable to continuing their conflicts. Mental health evaluations were conducted to assess whether Dorset's state of mind affected her culpability. While she experienced stress and anger related to the divorce, evaluators determined she understood her actions and their consequences. The planning evident in bringing a weapon to Moore's location suggested rational thought, not impulse. Dorset was convicted on charges related to Moore's death after trial proceedings where prosecutors presented their evidence, and her defense team argued mitigating factors. The jury deliberated and found her guilty, determining that the evidence proved beyond reasonable doubt that she was responsible. In 2012, Dorset was sentenced to 58 years in prison, a term that would keep her incarcerated well into old age. While not technically a life sentence, the lengthy term meant she would likely spend the remainder of her life behind bars given her age at sentencing. The sentence reflected both the premeditated nature of the shooting and the permanent harm caused. She remains incarcerated in New Jersey, serving her 58-year sentence. Parole eligibility remains distant, requiring her to serve a substantial portion of the term before consideration. The next case would involve a property dispute with even deadlier results. Sherry Lee Heffernan. In March 2021, Surf City, New Jersey became the scene of a double homicide that shocked the Shore community. Sherry Lee Heffernan, 55, had been in conflict with her father, John Heffernan, 87, over his plans to sell his home. The property dispute represented more than just real estate. It involved Sherry's sense of inheritance and control over family assets. John Heffernan wanted to sell his Surf City property, but Sherry vehemently opposed the decision. She believed the home should remain in the family and eventually transfer to her. His plans to sell and presumably use the proceeds threatened her expectations. The conflict escalated through arguments and disputes that neighbors occasionally overheard. John's girlfriend, Françoise Pitoy, 75, lived with him and supported his decision to sell. Her presence in John's life and her influence over his choices became another source of resentment for Sherry. She viewed Françoise as an outsider interfering in family matters and potentially benefiting from proceeds that Sherry felt belonged to her. On March 22, 2021, Sherry attacked both victims using both a knife and a firearm. The combination of weapons suggested rage and determination to ensure neither survived. John and Françoise were both elderly and unable to defend themselves against someone younger and armed. The attack occurred in the home that was at the center of the dispute. Emergency responders arriving at the scene found both victims deceased. The investigation immediately focused on Sherry given the known conflicts over the property. Forensic evidence from the scene linked her to the attacks. Blood evidence, fingerprints, and weapon analysis all pointed to her involvement. What evidence sealed her fate? Physical evidence placed Sherry at the scene during the relevant time frame. The weapons used belonged to her or were traced to her possession. Forensic specialists documented the sequence of events and determined that the attacks showed sustained effort rather than momentary rage. Both victims suffered multiple injuries, indicating continued assault. Digital evidence, including text messages and emails, documented the escalating conflict over the property sale. Financial records showed Sherry's economic situation and her expectations regarding inheritance. The paper trail established clear motive rooted in greed and desire to control family assets. Sherry was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree homicide along with weapons offenses. She faced trial in Ocean County, where prosecutors presented their case to a jury. The defense attempted to argue emotional distress and family conflict as mitigating factors, but the premeditated nature of bringing weapons and the sustained nature of the attacks undermined these arguments. The jury convicted Sherry on all counts, finding her guilty of ending both lives during the property dispute. The deliberations concluded that evidence proved beyond reasonable doubt her responsibility for both deaths. Victim impact statements from extended family described the horror of losing John and Françoise to family conflict. Sherry received 2 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. The consecutive nature, meaning one sentence after another rather than concurrent, emphasized that 2 separate lives were taken. New Jersey's most severe sentencing option reflected the court's determination that Sherry represented ongoing danger and deserved maximum consequences. She remains incarcerated in New Jersey's correctional system, where she will spend the remainder of her life. But the next case would involve circumstances beyond rational understanding. Naomi Elkins.
How could a mother, a daycare worker trusted with other people's children, commit such an unspeakable act against her own flesh and blood?
In October 2024, Lakewood, New Jersey experienced a tragedy that defied comprehension. Naomi Elkins, 27, took actions that resulted in the deaths of her 2 young sons in circumstances that prosecutors and mental health experts would describe as driven by severe psychiatric breakdown rather than rational thought. Elkins drowned her 2 toddlers, an act so horrific that investigators struggled to understand what could drive a mother to such actions. The drownings occurred in their Lakewood home, transforming a space that should represent safety into a scene of unimaginable loss. When authorities arrived, they found both young victims deceased. Elkins' behavior and statements immediately suggested severe mental health crisis rather than calculated criminality. She spoke about religious reasons and beliefs that didn't align with reality, indicating psychosis had distorted her perception of events. Mental health evaluations revealed Elkins had a documented history of psychiatric issues that had worsened in the period before the drownings. She experienced delusions and lost touch with reality, believing actions that harmed her sons somehow protected or helped them. The psychosis prevented her from understanding the wrongfulness of her actions at the time. What makes this case different from others? Unlike cases where defendants claim mental illness strategically, Elkins's psychiatric evaluation left no doubt about the severity of her break from reality. Multiple mental health experts agreed she was experiencing acute psychosis at the time of the drownings, meeting the legal standard for insanity defense. The insanity defense doesn't excuse actions or suggest someone shouldn't face consequences. Instead, it acknowledges that severe mental illness can impair someone's ability to distinguish right from wrong. When successfully proven, it shifts the focus from punishment to treatment in secure psychiatric facilities. In April 2025, the court found Elkins not guilty by reason of insanity. This verdict meant she wouldn't serve time in a traditional prison, but would instead be committed to a secure psychiatric hospital. The distinction matters. Psychiatric commitment focuses on treatment rather than punishment, though patients remain confined for public safety. Elkins was committed to a psychiatric facility for what amounts to 150 years, 75 years for each victim, running concurrently. This extraordinary term, described as equivalent to 2 lifetimes, ensures she will never be released unless her mental state improves to a degree that psychiatric experts deem her no longer dangerous. The likelihood of such improvement allowing release remains remote. The commitment means Elkins receives psychiatric medication, therapy, and treatment aimed at managing her condition. However, the secure nature of the facility means she cannot leave and has limited freedom. Regular evaluations assess whether she continues to pose risk, though the 150-year term suggests courts don't anticipate circumstances changing sufficiently for release. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case would cross state lines, though its connection to New Jersey remains. Ruth DiRienzo Whitehead.
Authorities responded to a distress call from a family home and discovered the lifeless body of a young child lying in bed. The boy was later identified as Matthew Whitehead, the son of Ruth DiRienzo Whitehead.
On April 10, 2023, Ruth DiRienzo Whitehead, 51, from Horsham, Pennsylvania, took the life of her son, Matthew. The tragedy unfolded in their Pennsylvania home, but its connection to New Jersey came when DiRienzo Whitehead drove toward the ocean afterward, crossing into the Garden State. The case exposed how financial desperation can spiral into unthinkable actions. DiRienzo Whitehead used a belt to end Matthew's life, an act that took sustained effort and time. The method required continued application of force, meaning she had multiple moments to reconsider but chose to continue. After his death, she drove to Wildwood Crest, New Jersey, heading toward the ocean in what appeared to be either an escape attempt or contemplation of her own fate. The family had been experiencing severe financial stress. DiRienzo Whitehead faced mounting economic pressures that contributed to her deteriorating mental state. Bills accumulated, debts grew, and she saw no way forward that didn't involve continued hardship. In her distorted thinking, she believed ending Matthew's life would spare him from suffering she anticipated. How did authorities respond? Police in Wildwood Crest encountered DiRienzo Whitehead and took her into custody. Her behavior and statements raised immediate concerns, leading investigators to discover what had occurred in Pennsylvania. The body was found at their Horsham residence, and autopsy results confirmed the cause of death. Mental health evaluations examined whether DiRienzo Whitehead experienced a psychotic break that prevented her from understanding her actions. Her defense team argued she had suffered a mental health crisis driven by financial despair, believing she was protecting Matthew from future pain. They characterized her actions as resulting from a temporary break with reality rather than criminal intent. Prosecutors presented a different interpretation. They argued that DiRienzo Whitehead's actions were driven by revenge rather than mercy, suggesting she wanted to cause pain to others in her life by taking Matthew. The sustained nature of the act, using a belt requires continued effort, undermined claims of a momentary break from reality. The trial in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, proceeded with extensive testimony from mental health experts, forensic specialists, and investigators. In February 2024, the jury convicted DiRienzo Whitehead, determining that regardless of her mental state, she was criminally responsible for Matthew's death. The verdict reflected their belief that she understood what she was doing. What did she say at sentencing? During sentencing, DiRienzo Whitehead stated, "I'm so sorry," expressing remorse for her actions. Her apology acknowledged the tragedy while offering no justification that could diminish what occurred. The brief statement left many questions unanswered about her thinking before, during, and after Matthew's death. She received a life sentence, ensuring she would spend the remainder of her days incarcerated for taking her son's life. DiRienzo Whitehead remains imprisoned in Pennsylvania, serving her life sentence. As of 2025, no appeals or new developments have altered her status. She serves her time while Matthew's family continues processing a loss that should never have occurred. Another case takes us back in time to a confrontation with law enforcement. Leslie A. Nelson. In 1995, Haddon Heights, New Jersey became the scene of a deadly encounter between police and a resident during a warrant execution. Leslie A. Nelson, who was born as Glenn and later transitioned, fired on officers who came to serve a search warrant at the residence. The confrontation would end with 2 officers dead, and Nelson facing the most serious charges New Jersey could bring. The incident involved an AK-47 rifle, a weapon capable of rapid fire that gave Nelson significant advantage during the standoff. When officers approached to execute their warrant, Nelson opened fire. The attack killed 2 law enforcement officers who were performing their duties, leaving their families devastated and their departments mourning. Nelson's background revealed struggles with mental health, including depression, and traits that complicated social interactions. Paranoia related to identity issues contributed to the mindset that led to viewing police as threats rather than public servants executing legal warrants. The combination of mental health challenges and access to powerful weapons created a deadly situation. What led to the confrontation? Officers had obtained a valid search warrant through proper legal channels, giving them authority to enter the property. The warrant was based on evidence suggesting illegal activity or items at the residence. Nelson's decision to respond with gunfire rather than comply with the warrant transformed a routine law enforcement procedure into a fatal shooting. The standoff continued until Nelson was subdued and taken into custody. Evidence collected from the scene included the AK-47 used in the shooting and ballistics confirming the weapon fired the rounds that struck the officers. Witness testimony from surviving officers and neighbors provided additional details about the sequence of events. Nelson faced trial on multiple charges, including the deaths of the 2 officers. The prosecution pursued the death penalty, seeking New Jersey's maximum punishment for killing law enforcement officers in the line of duty. The trial included extensive testimony about the incident, Nelson's mental state, and the circumstances leading to the shooting. Mental health became a central issue during proceedings. Defense attorneys argued that Nelson's documented psychological challenges affected judgment and decision-making. They presented evidence of depression, paranoia, and other conditions that they claimed diminished culpability. However, prosecutors countered that mental health issues didn't justify firing on officers executing a lawful warrant. How did the legal outcome evolve? Initially, Nelson received a death sentence, reflecting the jury's determination that the killings warranted capital punishment. The death penalty verdict placed Nelson on death row, awaiting execution. However, legal challenges followed that would ultimately change this outcome. Years later, the death sentence was vacated, replaced with life imprisonment. The change resulted from appeals addressing various legal issues in the original trial and sentencing. While the conviction remained intact, the punishment shifted from execution to spending the remainder of life behind bars. New Jersey's later abolition of the death penalty meant Nelson would never face execution regardless. Nelson serves the life sentence at Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for women in Clinton, New Jersey. The placement reflects Nelson's gender identity, with the state housing transgender inmates according to their identified gender when safety permits. The decades of incarceration mean Nelson has spent more time imprisoned than lived freely before the 1995 incident. As of 2025, no new developments have altered Nelson's status. The life sentence continues with no possibility of parole, ensuring Nelson will die in prison. But another case would gain national attention through media coverage. Diane Downs.
But the thing that really haunts me the most is not even the sight and the sound. I mean, the sound and the smell are fading. But at night, when I close my eyes, I can see Christy reaching her hand out to me while I'm driving, and the blood just keep coming out of her mouth. And that, maybe it'll fade too with time, but I don't think so.
In May 1983 in Oregon, Diane Downs committed an act that would captivate and horrify the nation for decades. Born in Phoenix, Arizona in 1955, Downs had a troubled upbringing that she later claimed included inappropriate treatment by her father, though she recanted these allegations. Her childhood in a strict conservative household led to rebellion against family values. She married Steve Downs in 1973, partially to escape her home environment. The marriage produced 3 offspring before deteriorating. On May 19, 1983, Downs drove her 3 young passengers on a rural Oregon road. She later claimed a stranger shot them during a carjacking attempt, but evidence would tell a different story. One of the 3 victims died, while the other 2 survived with serious injuries. Downs's behavior following the incident raised immediate suspicions. She appeared unnaturally calm when describing what allegedly happened, showing little emotional response appropriate for someone whose offspring had been shot. During interviews, her affect seemed inappropriate, displaying a disconnect between the severity of events and her reactions. What evidence contradicted her story? Forensic testing found no gunpowder residue on the car where she claimed the shooting occurred, a finding inconsistent with shots fired inside the vehicle. The absence of residue suggested the shooting happened differently than Downs described. Ballistics experts linked a .22 caliber handgun to the shooting, and evidence traced the weapon's possession to Downs. The surviving victims provided accounts that contradicted their mother's version of events. Their statements, combined with physical evidence, painted Downs as the shooter rather than an unknown carjacker. Investigators determined she had shot her own offspring, an act so incomprehensible that establishing motive became crucial. Psychological evaluations diagnosed Downs with narcissistic, histrionic, and antisocial personality disorders. The diagnoses helped explain her behavior and provided context for understanding how she could commit such acts. Her personality disorders affected her ability to form normal attachments and contributed to viewing her offspring as obstacles rather than people deserving protection. Downs was convicted and sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. The sentence ensured she would never regain freedom. Initially incarcerated in Oregon, she made headlines again in 1987 when she escaped from prison, remaining at large for 10 days before recapture. The escape demonstrated her continued danger and unwillingness to accept her fate. Later, Downs was transferred to New Jersey's Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women, creating her connection to the Garden State. The transfer occurred for security and administrative reasons, moving her across the country from where her crimes occurred. She spent years at the New Jersey facility before being transferred again. How has she responded to incarceration? Most recently, in October 2025, Downs appeared before Oregon's parole board, her latest in a series of unsuccessful parole attempts. During the hearing, she maintained her innocence, stating, "I did not shoot my children." Her continued denial after over 4 decades in prison demonstrated unwillingness to accept responsibility. The parole board denied her request, determining she still posed too great a risk for release. The denial meant she would remain imprisoned, with another opportunity to seek parole coming years later. Each denial reinforced that Oregon's justice system viewed her as too dangerous for freedom, regardless of time served. As of 2025, Downs continues serving her sentence with no realistic prospect of freedom. Her advanced age and the severity of her crimes mean she will almost certainly die in prison, never experiencing freedom again after that night in 1983 when she made choices that destroyed her family. Another case would involve a dismemberment that shocked the nation. Rita Glusman. Rita Glusman's story began in 1948 in Ukraine, where she was born to Holocaust survivor parents who carried trauma from the genocide. At 10 years old, she experienced assault, an event that shaped her psychological development. At 11, she faced abandonment that further traumatized her during crucial developmental years. Despite these challenges, Glusman became an activist, working to help her husband Yakov emigrate from the Soviet Union. The couple eventually settled in the United States, where they co-owned a business together. For years, they appeared successful, but beneath the surface, their marriage deteriorated. When Yakov initiated divorce proceedings in 1996, Rita's reaction would shock even hardened investigators. On April 6, 1996, Glusman enlisted her cousin's help to carry out an attack on Yakov in his Pearl River, New York apartment. The assault involved an axe and resulted in Yakov's death. What followed was even more disturbing. Glusman dismembered his body, an act requiring sustained effort and emotional detachment that suggested either extreme rage or calculated concealment. The body parts were placed in garbage bags and dumped in New Jersey's Passaic River, crossing state lines in an attempt to dispose of evidence. The choice of the river suggested hope that water would either destroy evidence or carry it away from the crime scene. However, some remains were discovered, triggering an investigation that would eventually trace back to Rita. What evidence connected her to the crime? The discovery of body parts led investigators to identify the victim as Yakov Glusman. Once his identity was established, police examined his personal life for potential suspects. Rita's contentious divorce proceedings and threats she had allegedly made brought her under immediate scrutiny. Her cousin's involvement provided additional evidence once investigators applied pressure. Forensic analysis linked the body parts to Yakov and established the cause of death. The axe used in the attack was recovered, and tool mark analysis connected it to injuries on the remains. Witness testimony about Rita's state of mind during the divorce added context about her emotional state and potential motive. Rita Glusman was charged federally and became the first woman convicted under the Violence Against Women Act for her role in Yakov's death. The federal charges stemmed from the interstate nature of disposing evidence in New Jersey while the attack occurred in New York. The conviction on federal charges meant she faced federal sentencing rather than state penalties. She received a life sentence in federal prison, expected to keep her incarcerated for the remainder of her life. The severity reflected both the brutal nature of the attack and the calculated dismemberment and disposal that followed. For years, Glusman served her sentence in the federal system. However, an unexpected development would change her status. In 2020, Rita Glusman was released from federal custody on compassionate grounds. The release came after she had served over 2 decades behind bars, with authorities determining that her health conditions and advanced age warranted compassionate release despite the life sentence. The compassionate release sparked controversy and debate. Yakov's family and supporters argued that Glusman's crimes were too heinous to warrant early release regardless of health issues. They maintained that a life sentence should mean life, and that compassion for the perpetrator ignored the permanent harm caused to the victim. Following release, Glusman relocated to Hackensack, New Jersey, living under supervision requirements. The conditions of her compassionate release included monitoring and restrictions on her activities, though she regained freedom denied to those serving traditional life sentences. As of 2025, no new developments have altered Glusman's status. She remains free, living in New Jersey under the terms of her compassionate release. The next case would involve a robbery with fatal consequences. Raquel Garajao. In 2017, Raquel Garajao was a former honors student at Brookdale Community College whose life had taken a dark turn. She found herself in what friends described as a toxic relationship with Joseph Villani, a connection that would lead her down a path ending in prison. Together, they planned and executed a robbery that escalated to tragedy. The target was Trupal Patel, identified as someone involved in substances that Garajao and Villani believed they could profit from. They plotted to rob Patel, planning the confrontation with deliberation rather than acting on impulse. Text messages between the couple showed discussion of their intentions, providing prosecutors with digital evidence of premeditation. On April 27, 2017, they carried out their plan. During the robbery, Patel was shot with a .22 caliber rifle. The wounds proved fatal, transforming a robbery into something far more serious. After Patel's death, Garajao and Villani took property, including a watch that had belonged to the victim. What evidence exposed their involvement? Text messages recovered from their phones showed not only planning, but also lack of remorse after the fact. The communications revealed Garajao discussing the incident without apparent guilt or regret, suggesting either emotional detachment or belief that their actions were justified. The digital trail provided prosecutors with clear evidence of both premeditation and post-crime mindset. Forensic analysis established that the .22 rifle found in their possession matched the weapon used in Patel's shooting. Ballistics experts confirmed the connection, eliminating doubt about which weapon caused death. The stolen watch was recovered, further linking them to the robbery that accompanied the shooting. Witness testimony placed Garajao and Villani in the area at the relevant time. Neighbors and others provided accounts that corroborated the prosecution's timeline of events. The combination of physical evidence, digital communications, and witness statements created an overwhelming case. Garajao faced trial in Monmouth County, New Jersey. Initially, the trial experienced complications related to juror misconduct, requiring legal proceedings to address whether the jury's deliberations had been compromised. Eventually, the misconduct issues were resolved, and the case proceeded to verdict. The jury convicted Garajao on charges related to Patel's death during the robbery. Under New Jersey law, deaths occurring during certain felonies like robbery can result in charges even if the death wasn't specifically intended. The felony murder rule held Garajao responsible for Patel's death because it occurred during their criminal enterprise. What sentence reflected her culpability? In 2021, Garajao was sentenced to 33 years in prison. The substantial term reflected both the robbery and the fatal outcome. Though it fell short of a life sentence, the 33-year term means Garajao won't be eligible for parole until 2047, when she'll have spent decades behind bars for her role in Patel's death. The sentence acknowledged that while Garajao participated in planning and executing the robbery, questions remained about who fired the weapon and what level of participation she had in the actual shooting. The court determined that 33 years balanced her involvement with recognition that Villani may have played a more direct role in the fatal shooting. As of 2025, no new developments have altered Garajao's status. She remains incarcerated in New Jersey, serving her 33-year sentence. Her earliest possible release in 2047 means she'll be in her 40s before any chance of freedom, having spent her entire young adulthood behind bars. The final case would involve poison and professional access. Tianlei Li. In 2011, Tianlei Li, a chemist working at Bristol-Myers Squibb in New Jersey, found herself in a deteriorating marriage with her husband Xiaoye Wang. Both were Chinese immigrants who had built careers in the United States, but their relationship had reached a breaking point. As divorce proceedings loomed, Li made a decision that would utilize her professional expertise in the darkest way possible. Li had access to thallium, a toxic heavy metal, through her work as a chemist. The substance is highly toxic to humans even in small doses, causing symptoms that can mimic other conditions and making it difficult to diagnose thallium poisoning without specific testing. Her professional position gave her both knowledge of the poison's effects and access to obtain it. Over time in late 2010 and early 2011, Li administered thallium to Wang. The poisoning occurred gradually, with Wang experiencing symptoms that initially weren't recognized as poisoning. He suffered neurological effects, weakness, and other health problems that worsened as Li continued dosing him with the toxic substance. What finally revealed the poisoning? Wang's condition deteriorated to the point where he sought medical attention. Doctors initially struggled to diagnose the cause of his symptoms, running tests for various conditions. Eventually, specific testing revealed extremely high levels of thallium in his system, far beyond what could occur through accidental exposure. Medical professionals immediately recognized this as poisoning rather than accidental contamination. The levels found in Wang's urine indicated deliberate administration of substantial quantities. Once poisoning was confirmed, attention turned to who had access to both Wang and thallium. Li's profession and her deteriorating marriage made her an obvious suspect. Police obtained a warrant to search her laptop and found incriminating evidence. She had researched articles about thallium poisoning, reading about its effects, detection, and use as a poison. The search history demonstrated knowledge and planning rather than coincidental interest. Investigators traced Li's acquisition of thallium through her workplace. While she had legitimate access to various chemicals in her role as a chemist, the removal of thallium for personal use violated company policies and legal restrictions on toxic substances. The evidence trail connected her to both the poison and its administration to Wang. Li was arrested and charged with attempted homicide. The charges reflected that Wang survived the poisoning, though he suffered permanent damage from the thallium exposure. Had he died, the charges would have been even more severe. But his survival meant she faced attempted charges rather than completed homicide. The trial in New Jersey presented the prosecution's evidence: the thallium levels in Wang's system, Li's access to the poison, her laptop searches, and the timing coinciding with their divorce proceedings. The defense attempted to argue alternative explanations, but the evidence was overwhelming. The combination of motive, means, and opportunity all pointed to Li. The jury convicted Li on all counts, determining that evidence proved beyond reasonable doubt that she had deliberately poisoned her husband. The verdict reflected their conclusion that her professional expertise had been weaponized against Wang in an attempt to eliminate him rather than proceed with divorce. Li was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The sentence ensured she would never be released, spending the remainder of her days behind bars for attempting to poison Wang. New Jersey's harshest sentence option reflected the calculated nature of her actions and the abuse of professional position. Li appealed her conviction, arguing various legal issues with the trial and evidence. In 2021, New Jersey's appellate courts upheld the conviction, determining that the trial had been fair and the evidence sufficient. The appeal denial meant her conviction and life sentence stood firm. As of 2025, no new developments have altered Li's status. She remains incarcerated in New Jersey's correctional system, serving her life sentence. Her case highlighted dangers when people with access to dangerous substances through their professions abuse that access for criminal purposes. Li remains imprisoned with no possibility of release, ensuring she'll die behind bars for attempting to poison her husband during their divorce. Her professional expertise, which should have been used to benefit society through pharmaceutical research, became the means of her crime and the evidence that convicted her. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.